Right. I'm excited to introduce today's speakers, Barbara Sutherland and Rona Roberts. They are white senior citizens who have been friends since college. Both have lived in Lexington for about 50 years. Rona is a writer and researcher, and Barbara is a retired city employee and librarian. They share a long-term concern about racial justice. During the summer of 2020, they were both inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and by an article about the possibilities for a racially equitable economy. They recommitted to working with other people to further this goal. They decided to study the history and the impact of segregated housing in Lexington and discovered ways in which government at all levels perpetuated segregation through much of the 20th century. Their first audiences were primarily white people, but gradually the audience began to shift. Barbara and Rona are presently part of a new Black-led organization called Black Yarn, which is raising funds to transform segregation research into a full-length documentary. The documentary will tell the Lexington story of Black land and wealth, success, and struggles with living Lexingtonians as key resources. The segregated history will become part of a larger narrative. I am pleased to introduce Barbara Sutherland and Rona Roberts. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Are we muted? No.
I unmuted myself.
Oh, good.
Good.
Barbara, if you'll talk for a minute, I will work on sharing my screen.
Okay. We're especially pleased to be speaking with the League of Women Voters because, as I'm sure you know, the League has been active in fair housing issues for many, many years. And we've actually used some of your work in our research. There's a especially good booklet that the League did in, I'm thinking it was in about 1980 about fair housing, and it had discussion about how to make sure you're getting fair housing, and also featured a really good article by George Wright about growing up in segregated Lexington in one of the housing projects. So it looks like Rona has her screen up. And so I think we're ready to start.
Yeah, let's go. Welcome everyone to our work in progress. Thank you for being here today and for being part of the League. We're here to share key findings from research about 20th century residential segregation in Lexington as we understand it right now. Our understanding changes and it evolves as we continue our research. This presentation documents some of Lexington's history as a segregated city and Black resilience and resourcefulness in the face of that history. At the end of the presentation, we provide a link so you can access the slides online if you would like.
In her 1993 inauguration poem, Maya Angelou said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And so we thank you for having the courage to face some Lexington history with us today. Thank you. Our intention in this presentation is to describe and acknowledge the history of residential segregation here in Lexington. And you can find more information and detail about what we've learned so far, along with the resources we used, and that includes the League of Women Voters booklets. That's at our research website, which is called segregatedlexington.com. And finally, we need to tell you before we get going that this presentation includes excerpts from historical documents, and some of those do contain disturbing language. And we appreciate your willingness to face information that's difficult to hear.
Residential segregation is one root cause of ongoing Black-white inequality in life circumstances and prospects. It affects home ownership, wealth, and just about every other facet of daily life. Facing these facts squarely is necessary for recognizing the invaluable resistance of local Black families and beginning repair. In studying residential segregation, we've relied a great deal on the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. In his book, Rothstein emphasizes how much governments and businesses did to construct and maintain segregated communities. He explains that segregation required, promoted, or endorsed by government is called de jure segregation. It has had more impact than de facto segregation, which is the type that results from personal preference.
Rothstein's book tells the national story of intentional de jure segregation. And our local research shows us that Lexington is part of that national story, because here in our own community, government, private interests denied homeownership opportunities to African Americans and destroyed some Black neighborhoods. And they did this through racially restrictive deed covenants, redlining, steering by realtors, certain planning and zoning practices, and urban renewal. And so now we'll share some examples of how some of these segregating forces operated here in Lexington. And we will begin with racially restrictive deed covenants.
A racially restrictive covenant written into a property deed prohibited the buyer from selling or renting that property to people of a specified race. So in Lexington, the restrictive covenants most often singled out African Americans. These covenants were most prevalent in the first half of the 20th century. As Lexington expanded outward, Black and white families had radically different opportunities. White people enjoyed an enormous array of new home ownership choices, while Black families were largely excluded from developing areas.
The language of restrictive covenants can be shocking, as you'll see from the examples we're sharing. This one concerns Goodrich Avenue, which is near Southland Drive. In 1927, all the property owners on Goodrich Avenue signed an agreement saying that no property on Goodrich could ever be sold or leased to an African American or association of African Americans, but it provided that servants of any race could remain on the property. And this example is from Liberty Heights subdivision, which is off Winchester Road. And it says that if the property was ever sold or leased to an African American, the title would revert back to the original owner.
Some restrictive covenants affected only individual homes, but many covenants applied to entire subdivisions. This example is from a 1921 deed for a property on Victory Avenue. That's off Richmond Road in a subdivision that was then called Beachland, which later became part of what we know as Kenwick.
And we found those restrictive covenants and many, many more by sampling deeds at the Fayette County Clerk's office. We started by looking at deeds in neighborhoods we thought could have been affordable and appealing to working families, including Black working families. And so far, we found restrictive covenants in every pre-1948 neighborhood we've studied. And we are convinced that restrictive covenants were widespread in Lexington until the mid-20th century.
You may wonder if your neighborhood has racially restrictive covenants. So this slide shows some quite familiar neighborhoods where we're sure covenants existed, including Kenwick, Castlewood Drive, and others. As we continue our research, many more neighborhoods will join this list. We've recently started a project in which community volunteers and student interns are studying deeds and plats for all Lexington neighborhoods developed through the 1960s. Then we will have, when it's done, we will have a clearer picture of how restrictive covenants affected our community. Barbara's managing this project, And if you would like to volunteer or have questions, we are going to share Barbara's contact information at the end of this presentation.
And I'm going to just interject right here that Mark Scar, one of your members, has recently signed up and gone through the orientation for helping us with that research.
And he lived to tell a tale.
And he's so far, so good. Yeah.
And I'm coming back.
Good.
Great.
So, who was responsible for our city's restrictive covenants? Well, the government played a really big role. The Federal Housing Administration often required restrictive covenants as a condition of insuring home loans. And the Property Recording Office and the courts maintained the records and enforced the covenants. And individual property sellers and buyers and developers and builders, those were the ones who created or at least accepted the covenants, as did real estate agents, banks, and lawyers who took part in the sales.
In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that state courts could no longer enforce restrictive covenants. 7 decades later, the covenant's ugly legacy lives on. White families could buy any house they could afford and start building equity and generational wealth. Until at least 1948, deed restrictions significantly narrowed housing choices for Black families and reduced their opportunities to build equity and wealth. Restrictive covenants furthered segregated patterns that continue to this day. So just imagine for a minute what our community might have been like if every neighborhood had been integrated from the beginning. But instead, we all lost decades of experience in creating a diverse, welcoming community. We've just shown how government and private interests perpetuated segregation in Lexington through restrictive covenants. Our next topic is redlining, in which government played an even more significant role.
Redlining is the name that has been given to the practice of denying home loans in particular neighborhoods based on race. And the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, was the main perpetrator. The FHA insured home loans made by banks and other private lenders to white home buyers while refusing to do the same for Black home buyers. The FHA appraisers made their lending decisions using color-coded maps and a bias-filled instruction book called the underwriting manual.
Nearly all the FHA redlining maps disappeared around 1970, all the ones in the country, including Lexington's. In their place, many who study redlining use maps from a similar federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. This is Lexington's HOLC map. HOLC collected information from local realtors and city leaders and used it to divide cities into 4 grades based on several factors, including race. We still can't pinpoint Lexington's exact FHA redlining boundaries, but we know there was redlining here because it was national FHA policy. This map from Chicago is one of the few FHA maps that did survive. We're using it here to underscore the big differences in the ways the FHA treated residents in the differently colored zones. The FHA insured mortgages of 25 years, 20 years, or 10 years in classes A, B, and C, but no mortgages at all in class D, the large dark maroon section in the middle of this map, which included most African-American neighborhoods. So they actually had zero access to the benefits of that come from FHA loans.
The FHA offered low down payments, which enabled many white families to buy homes for the first time. And its long-term mortgages, compared to the 5-year terms that were typical until then, resulted in lower monthly payments. And all of this provided a huge economic benefit that went almost entirely to white families.
In addition to the maps, FHA appraisers relied on the underwriting manual, which was a government document that actually required restrictive covenants. It ruled out loans in integrated neighborhoods, and it ruled out loans even in areas where African Americans lived nearby. As a result, African Americans were very unlikely to get FHA loans, either in Black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, or integrated neighborhoods. The vast majority of FHA loans went to white families in white neighborhoods.
The FHA did not just insure loans for individual homes. The FHA loans could subsidize whole new subdivisions. The new suburbs, which were expanding rapidly in the 1940s, had to comply with the underwriting manual Rona just talked about, so they could not be integrated. And thus, suburban development provided more home choices to whites while denying those choices to Blacks. Based on our calculations, here's what we know right now about the 16 years of rapid suburban expansion in Lexington after the end of World War II. More than 15,000 new home lots became available during that period, and Black families had access to 225 of those, which is 1.45%.
In 1968, the Fair Housing Act made redlining illegal, but its impacts continue in 2024. In Lexington, as in the rest of the country, most homes that white working families bought during the redlining period have now increased in value many times over, and they were affordable homes at that time. That increase in home equity has provided wealth that continues to pass down from parents and grandparents to younger generations. This generational wealth has enabled white families to send kids to college, make home improvements, help adult kids with down payments, and much more. But the FHA denied benefits to most Black families during that crucial period in our country's financial history. Although some Black families have thrived in spite of these injustices, most have not been able to catch up in terms of building wealth. This difference is an important cause of the huge gap in wealth between Black and white families. A recent study found that the typical Black family in the United States had about 17 cents per $1 of white wealth. Now we consider some planning and zoning practices in Lexington that added to neighborhood inequities and resulted in even more entrenched segregation.
Lexington adopted its first zoning ordinance in 1930 with the stated purpose of promoting the public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. But in practice, the ordinance offered fewer protections for Black and low-income Lexingtonians than for middle-class whites.
Several of Lexington's urban African-American neighborhoods began as settlements created after the Civil War when landowners sold lots to formerly enslaved people. We are told that these settlements were neighborly, welcoming places to live. At the same time, many were near railroads, dumps, or industrial areas. The 1930 zoning ordinance grandfathered in these and other existing uses without taking into account the negative health impacts on African Americans living nearby. In addition, the ordinance created new industrial zones near some predominantly African American neighborhoods. And as we have seen, African Americans already faced severe restrictions on their choice of neighborhood and their options for moving to healthier areas.
The Planning Commission acknowledged those planning choices in a 1967 report about 13 neighborhoods that faced particular challenges. Those neighborhoods highlighted here in dark yellow included the areas where most African Americans lived at the time. The report described problems such as warehouses so close to residences that they deprived families of light and air, or industrial and heavy commercial activities next to residences. And these and similar planning choices negatively affected all 13 of those neighborhoods.
Here is how one unhealthy situation looked. This is Davistown, one of the 13 neighborhoods that we just described. As you see, there is no separation between an auto junkyard and occupied homes. This particular situation continued at least until this 1980 photograph was taken.
Our zoning ordinances and regulations have also contributed to segregation and inequity by restricting so much of our residential land to zones where only single-family detached homes are allowed. This makes all Lexington housing less affordable by artificially limiting the supply, and it blocks many families from living in higher opportunity neighborhoods. And it reduces the likelihood that people of different life circumstances will be neighbors.
Things may improve under Lexington's newly adopted comprehensive plan, Imagine Lexington 2045. This new plan acknowledges the role that planning policies and practices have played in segregation and inequity, and it sets out new equity policies. It also proposes changes designed to increase the supply of housing and thus make it more affordable. You can read and comment on the entire plan or a summary at www.imaginelexington.com/2045. This slide shows 6 of the 11 equity policies set out in Imagine Lexington 2045. These lofty goals will only result in real change when they are reflected in the zoning ordinance. So as I understand it, these have been adopted by council as goals and are now in process of, the planning staff is developing proposed zoning ordinance changes that would put these into practice. They would allow more types of multifamily housing in some zones, allow smaller homes in smaller lots, and more. The planning staff is working on more revisions, which must be approved by the Urban County Council. These equitable new practices are more likely to be adopted and implemented if we, as a community, explicitly support them. On the Division of Planning website, you can read about proposed zoning ordinance changes and submit comments. You can learn about Planning Commission and Council. This is the League of Women Voters, so you know this, but you can learn about Planning Commission and Council meetings on the planning website and through civiclex.org.
In addition to the factors we've already described, for decades, realtors perpetuated segregation by steering home buyers away from neighborhoods that didn't match their race.
Starting in 1924, the National Realtors Code of Ethics said a realtor should not help introduce into a neighborhood, quote, members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Lexington Realtors followed this policy for many years.
In the mid-1960s, Black and white people began challenging the realtors' practices. O.M. Travis Jr., pictured here with his family, was a prominent African-American real estate and insurance broker, and he was later on the city council. But before that, he applied for membership in Lexington's Board of Realtors, and he applied twice. His application was denied both times, and he believed the board denied his membership to prevent him from using the multiple listing services. Some of you all, like me, will remember that back then, before the internet and before Zillow, the multiple listing service was the only way that realtors could show their clients all the houses on the market. Mr. Travis was finally admitted to the Board of Realtors on his third application. That was in 1973, 5 years after passage of the Fair Housing Act. Also in the mid-1960s, an African-American sociology professor, and actually he was the first African-American full professor at the University of Kentucky, Joseph Scott, he and his family bought a new home in the all-white Province subdivision, which is next to Cardinal Valley. Their white realtor, Ben Story, received open vocal criticism from other realtors, and he also received anonymous threats signaling that he had violated accepted community norms.
In 1968, the Fair Housing Act made racial steering illegal. 10 years later, in 1978, and again in 1987, the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights studied racial steering in Lexington using trained white and Black testers. In 1978, they found discrimination by real estate agents or apartment managers in 2 out of 3 cases. That rate had declined by 1987, but was still 38%, more than 1/3 of cases.
By 1974, the National Association of Realtors had changed its code of ethics to require fairness instead of deny it. And in 2020, they apologized for their past racist practices, which included steering.
In 1979, Lexington's Association of Realtors made an agreement with the local NAACP and Fair Housing Council. The realtors committed to train real estate agents about fair housing law and to recruit board members from underrepresented populations. Now, Bluegrass Realtors has an active diversity committee and requires all new members to complete a fair housing course within 6 months of joining.
Although realtor steering is no longer policy among realtors and is in fact illegal, people living in Lexington still feel its impacts. Steering contributed to the huge gap in home ownership between Black and white Lexington families, and it contributed to the ongoing segregation of our neighborhoods.
When we say segregation is ongoing, this is what we mean. This table uses a measure of segregation called the dissimilarity index. In Lexington, segregation has gone up and down over the decades, but so far has never been less than 42%. The dissimilarity index is complicated, and we say more about it on segregatedlexington.com. The short version is that a higher number means greater segregation. The legal segregation of the past meant that Black families could not legally live where they chose, and in fact, Black families in Lexington were essentially confined to a few neighborhoods until the late 1960s.
Although their choices about where to live were limited, African Americans in Lexington created strong communities where they did live. Over the years, many African American residents have talked about their neighborhoods as supportive places where community life was rich and welcoming, and neighbors were resilient and resourceful. In fact, one of those people who talked about that was George Wright, whose article is included in that League of Women Voters pamphlet we mentioned. In some Black neighborhoods, people of all income and education levels interacted daily, and many of the blocks had homes of various sizes. Neighbors knew each other and stepped in to help each other out, and children received attention from many caring adults, like this patrolman who's teaching children from Constitution School how to be effective crossing guards.
Segregated neighborhood schools had fewer resources than white schools, but Black teachers saw their students' potential and worked tirelessly to further it. The two bottom photos here include examples of students honored for academic success. I think these are about the National Honor Society.
Yeah, the one on the left is of students who are in the National Honor Society. And the one on the right shows a young man who won the citywide speech contest. And he's in that photo, he's just received the award for that from his teacher.
I think the upper left beautiful photo of I think it's a class at Booker T, we believe.
Uh-huh.
And then on the upper right is Tay Seals at Douglas Park, and he is coaching some young men for the soapbox derby that was a very big competition at Douglas Park for a while. So in segregated parks, leaders and neighbors made sure children had plenty of supervised activities.
And Black residents formed many churches along with social, cultural, and charitable organizations. In her 2013 PhD dissertation, Dr. Karen McDaniel pointed out that in the early 20th century Kentucky, middle-class Black women initiated many charitable programs and every progressive reform that white women instigated, even though Black women did not have access to the same wealth or protection from violence or the same publicity opportunities. This slide up on the top left, the photo on the top left is from a newspaper article about a nursery that the Women's Improvement Club created to serve babies and toddlers whose mothers would otherwise have had to leave them home alone when they went out to work. And that day nursery lasted for many, many, many years. So despite Black resilience in the face of it, the fact remains that Lexington has been segregated by design, that is intentionally, and that segregation both continues and continues to matter today. Explicit legal segregation ended in 1968, but its impacts continue in the form of ongoing segregation, a Black-white wealth gap that has not narrowed in decades, and a continued and even growing homeownership gap between Black and white families. Segregation continues today. In 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And in honor of that occasion, Art Crosby of the Lexington Fair Housing Council was asked how far we've come in achieving the goals of the Fair Housing Act. And in his response, he noted that we seem to have grown comfortable with how things are. And then he added, these racially segregated neighborhoods, however, did not organically happen over time because of personal preferences. They were created through a systemic process to isolate wealth and opportunities for one race over another.
According to a 2024 study by Dr. Elora Dernoncourt of Princeton, in a study she did with 3 colleagues, it's published just this year, there is now a white to Black 6-to-1 wealth gap. Another way of saying 6-to-1 ratio is $1 to 17 cents. And this Black-white wealth gap continues virtually unchanged. In a 2018 Federal Reserve study, researchers said that no progress has been made in reducing income and wealth inequalities between Black and white households over the past 70 years.
And the Black-white home ownership gap continues. Lexington's Black households own their own homes at less than half the rate of white households.
As Richard Rothstein has said, undoing the effects of de jure segregation will be incomparably difficult. To make a start, we will first have to contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Rothstein's new book, Just Action, describes how some people and groups around the country are accepting that responsibility to fix what we've collectively done. Rothstein wrote Just Action with his daughter, Leah Rothstein, who is a housing advocate. And they suggest several types of policies and programs that are shown on this slide that they believe will help communities begin to remedy decades of segregation. And as you can see, all of these programs and policies will be difficult to implement. Some will be controversial. The intensity and difficulty of that work requires that it take place in dedicated supportive groups. And here in Lexington, some groups have already undertaken parts of that work, and we hope that many more will soon join in.
As for us, in the past year, we have joined with others to form a nonprofit organization called Black Yarn. It's a Black-led group. You can learn more about us at black-yarn.com. Our launch project is production of a full-length documentary film that will expand and improve on this slide presentation. And that documentary film project is underway. You can access these presentation slides at segregatedlexington.com/handout. And here is the coveted information about how to reach Barbara Sutherland, who's heading up the deed research project, aldenruths@gmail.com. I'll leave that there for just a second and say how much we thank you for your participation. And we invite you to make comments, questions, whatever you would like. I can also, I'm sorry, I can share some questions with you if you feel like you'll need to have something to kick off our conversation, but you certainly don't need to address these unless they intrigue you. And
Yes,
yes, shall I
Sorry.
stop sharing?
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
Let's look at these questions for just a minute, Rona, and hopefully we'll have some questions for you and Barbara.
Okay.
This is Sharon Stewart, and I just have a comment, if that's okay.
Sure.
I moved here in December of 1972, long time ago, but it was a few years after the fair housing, from what I hear you explaining. And I was so surprised when I moved here, because one of the things that happened was that when we would call to inquire about renting an apartment, every landowner or person that was the individual we were to contact wanted to meet with us in person.
Mm.
And when we met with them, they would just come right out and say, we wanted to see what race you were.
Uh-huh.
And so that
Wow.
was years after all this was
Oh,
enacted.
yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure they wouldn't have been so blunt had we been persons of color.
Oh,
But
yeah.
since we weren't, I guess they just felt like we would agree with them and say, well, of course, or something. But we were really surprised. And just, I don't know how to say it other than that. We were shocked and very concerned about where we were moving.
Yeah.
We were
Yeah.
moving to Lexington.
I would
Um,
also like to make a quick comment. This is Liz. I'm so deeply impressed with the work that you have done here. I greatly appreciate it. I know archival research like this really takes a lot of effort and time. So I want to say thank you for that on behalf of our community, because I think this is really powerful and meaningful work. So thank you.
Thank you.
And for all you
Yes.
do for our community too.
yes.
This is Lynn. I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Am I getting through? Okay.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
My parents bought their first house with a VA loan. What do you know about the VA loans and racial discrimination?
We don't know as much about VA loans as we wish we knew. What we do know is that the VA program, when those loans were started, it wasn't just to buy homes, it was also to go to college. They paid GIs to go to college, including my father. What we do know is that in the debates in Congress about this program, the senators from the very deep South insisted that the program be operated at the local level rather than the national level. And so the experience of Black GIs with the VA was very different depending on where they were and the local boards, the attitudes of the local boards. But we have not found, we can't say for sure that we have dug as deep as we possibly could, but we haven't found enough information to really talk about the experience of Black GIs here in Lexington. It was definitely a mixed bag.
Thank you.
I think when I read Rothstein's book, he said it pretty much meant that Blacks did not get VA loans, and that their experiences post-war were of inequality,
Oh, absolutely.
which
Yeah.
of course doesn't surprise me, but I think that's was true across America, and it's not I mean, it's probably more openly discussed in the Dixiecrat states, but I assume from what I've read that it doesn't exclude any other states.
I think you're right about that.
This is Mary. I think some of this information I did know, and I did read The Color of Law, as Mo did, but just that those facts, like the amount of Black wealth as opposed to white wealth and those kinds of things. I mean, I knew there was a great discrepancy, but that just really is a slap in the face and just, wow, how can that be? Yeah, this is a fascinating program, and I hope that I know it's been widely shown because a number of people had said they had seen it, which is wonderful. And yes, I'm glad that you're taking this on further to get even more information and disseminate it, and making sure more people know about this situation so that we can continue to try to address housing and other segregated acts in this community and others. We have, okay, this Deb Grainer is saying, is the presentation available to share? I have a friend from Georgia who is taking a position with Lexington Urban Planning, and he'd love this history.
Oh.
The slides are available without the speaker notes, and I can easily make a PDF of the whole thing. If this person would put an email address in the chat, I guess I can send that to you.
Okay, that's Deb Grainer, who is a league member. So Deb, if you heard that, if you'll put your
Or I
email
can put my email address in the chat and you can send
Okay.
it to me.
And it might be good for us to have, and we can just send to everybody that attended the presentation because other people might want it.
Well,
Right.
I'll say one thing about that.
Oh, okay.
We
Okay.
have been reluctant to have it kind of escape into the wild because it keeps changing. We keep learning things. So we've been much more willing to share it one by one. But what do you think, Barbara?
I think we can share the speaker notes, but yeah, it always has to be with a grain of salt because it does change.
Right. Quite a
I
bit.
I also want to say that when you put it 6 to 1 doesn't really mean anything, but $1 to 17 cents. I think that was very wise of you to put it that way, because that's huge. We had another book we read, Barry, and I can't remember the name of it, but the woman did come to UK and I did get to hear her speak. And she said it really limits what can happen to white people's experience if they do things like they closed a pool rather than letting Blacks in.
This is
and all
Heather
that.
McGee, we think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Heather McGee, of course. Yes.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
just-
so it's just it really hurts everybody in the long run. So
Yes, it really does. And the article that kicked off Barbara's and my work together in 2020 made that point also. It's called Centering Blackness, A Path to Economic Equality for All, I think is the name of it. It's just so good.
I've just been reading a book. I keep talking about it and I keep saying I'm reading it because I never quite get it finished, but it's called, I don't think, well, I can't. Oh, there we go. Excluded by, I can't do it. It's called Excluded. And the author is Richard Kahlenberg, Kahlenberg. The library has it. And what's interesting about this book is it's about zoning and how zoning has perpetuated segregation, and that the impact of that has been the impact of that kind of zoning, this exclusionary zoning, is that housing is more expensive now for all of us, and especially middle, lower middle, and low income families. So it's not just affecting Black families, even though the exclusionary zoning was in part motivated by the desire to keep Black families out of neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah. We have in our chat, your website is there in your chat, in the chat, and also Rona's email, great, and then Excluded. Rona put that in with the author, and that's great. And Deb Grainer's email is in there, but if you don't get it, we also have it with the league. And
I
you
have
can
it.
contact me.
I think I have it.
Good, thank you. Great. Are there any other questions or comments for Rona and Barbara?
So what do you suggest in the years coming forth, or tomorrow or the next day, I guess I could say, that we could do to help change this?
We get this question a lot, and we can point you back to this slide about how hard things will be to do, what hard things there are that we can do, and to Richard Rothstein's quote, which says, to make a start, we will first have to contemplate, which is really what we're doing here today, is we're contemplating what we've done. I'm not sure Barbara, well, Barbara, I'll just say this for me and you can say whether you agree. One of the things that we think would make a very big difference here in Lexington is for people who are interested in this to become much more engaged with the planning, with the work that's going on in planning right now, to develop the ordinances based on these very lofty goals that council passed. There's a history of very lofty goals that don't really go anywhere. And they don't go anywhere because when it comes to councils having to develop the ordinances and vote on them, many people whose lives will be affected in a way that they don't want show up and oppose. So we believe that is one really active place, right? And it's underway at this moment that people can get involved with. What do you think, Barbara? What do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And there's also another group, Kentucky Tenants, I think they're called, that have been very active in working with tenants. And they seem to be doing some interesting work. You know, the other thing is, and I know this just sounds kind of Pollyannish, but talking about this with your family, friends, and neighbors, I think, because people are so often surprised by this information. And so just kind of sharing that with them, I think, can be, and especially because people talk so much now about the cost of housing. And I think when those conversations come up, then that's a good opening for raising these questions.
Liz, can you talk about this event you just posted, which I just saw about it yesterday? It looks wonderful.
Yeah, there's actually several things. I just put in 2 links in the chat. One is the Imagine Lexington website, which they referenced in their presentation today. but there's the urban growth management ZODAs that are upcoming. And those are under review by council now. And I think this is a good time, as you suggested, Rona, to get involved and give your input. And then the event that I put in there, there's actually a couple different really cool ones that are on the website, but that particular event is around the urban growth management plan that is underway currently. The city planners are working with some consultants to look at careful design of the limited expansion that we're undergoing now, and exactly what types of housing should go there, what types of economic development or job opportunities should go in those spaces, how they should look, all of those kinds of things. And they have actually 2 or 3, I can't remember, like design kind of times coming up in the next week that are called charrettes, where you can come and kind of play with design. There's one in the evening and there's one during the day, and they're both at the Pam Miller Downtown Arts Center. And then there's also this festival at the Y, at the Whitaker Y, that is all about the urban growth management plan and like learning about that and giving input. So there's a lot of stuff going on even within the next week that you could get actively involved in these things within the planning processes here in Lexington.
That sounds great.
Yes, it's really exciting to have those opportunities.
Yes, well, we have some wonderful resources that people have shared and that Rona and Barbara have shared with us. So I hope people are ready to dive in and learn even more and help in their own way toward this.
I had a
effort.
couple real quick things if I could get them in.
Yes, please, Mark.
I think it's interesting to make sure people know the difference between wealth and income, because I think it's easy to think that this can be solved if people just have higher incomes, and the overall effects of housing segregation on education is a big deal. And here, I've been thinking about this for a long time. My talk about Pollyanna, it's probably would be illegal, but neighborhood schools, all that is like, well, if the neighborhoods are segregated, it gets you. But what if you could give a tax break if you had someone of a different race as your neighbor? I mean, that would give an incentive for people to integrate their neighborhoods.
That's right. I love that.
My next door neighbor is Black, Chelsea, and apparently I went over and talked to her because I'm a neighbor and we've gone out to lunch, and she said I was the only one that did that. And she's lived here 25 years. Not that actually anybody said hi to me when I first moved into the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But so maybe it's just not. But their kids went to school together and stuff. It's sad. It's pretty sad.
I have a question and an observation.
Yes, Kathy.
My observation is I just moved to Lexington about a year and a half ago, and in my previous community, it was a very diverse, small little town in Florida, and I served on the planning and zoning board. And one of the observations that I made on the planning and zoning board was that the wealthier areas of town, or the whiter areas of town, if something was proposed to come in or there was a zoning change being made, they would come out in force if they wanted it or didn't want it. Whether it was, usually it was business related or multifamily housing or low income housing, workforce housing, not my backyard. They would come out in force. And in the lower income areas or the more racially diverse areas, we received no response. So I think that the planning and zoning aspect is really important. And those of us that have the time and the voice need to really help speak out. I personally live in District 1 right now. I could, if I were a younger person, probably walk to several strip clubs. And you don't see those in other areas of town. So that's just my observation, is that planning and zoning today is a huge impact on communities. My question is, back in the day, I can see what stake realtors felt they had in segregation, but what was the FHA's reasoning behind redlining? Why did they not want to give loans? Was it repayment? What was their motive? What was the FHA's motive behind it?
That's a hard question to answer. It's that there's not well, it's kind of a long answer and a detailed answer, but there were essentially there was a common belief among white Americans that having African Americans in a neighborhood inherently diminished the value of the property. This was never tested. There was no scientific or sociological basis for it, but it was a widely held belief. And there were some people within the FHA who held that belief very strongly and had great influence. And so that became the policy of the FHA. It was, well, I think I'll stop there and let Rona respond as well.
The only thing I would add is that every time we do this presentation and we go through the slide about how realtors, bankers, and others created these 4 zones, which were part of FHA and Holk, I think we have to acknowledge that the views that African Americans living in a place or owning homes in a place are going to lower property values were very widely shared, and shared by community leaders across this country. It's, I think there's a deep root of pure othering, pure racism, because of just, not ever thinking or being guided to think to the deep root of it. Richard Rothstein says that these prejudices have never been tested. Barbara said that too. I don't know how they would be tested at this point, but they profoundly affected the structures that we live in now, and the racial wealth gap especially.
And also there was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at play there as well, because as you saw in that one slide, in Lexington, for example, there were very few neighborhoods where Black people could live. I mean, just were allowed to live. And the result of that, of course, is overcrowding. And so and all the difficulties that come with that. And also because of lack of wealth, lack of FHA loans for home rehabilitation, and the increasing amount of white ownership of rental properties in those neighborhoods, that the houses were not as well maintained in many cases. And so then white people could point and go, you see, this is what happens when Black people live in your neighborhood. And of course, this whole situation was created by the racism and the segregation that was imposed, and the unwillingness of the FHA and other government agencies to help. And so it's a matter of, well, I guess I'm going to use 2, what are they called? Adages. One is blaming the victim and the other is self-fulfilling prophecy,
Mhm.
both at work here.
Yes, yes. Again, this has just been an amazing program. I hope all of us will attempt to make others aware of this. And Barbara and Rona, we thank you so much for this opportunity to hear this story of your research and what we hope will be a successful creation of a full-length documentary and more research and more action plans. And thank you to people that have shared Liz Sheehan with information about how we can all get involved in planning and what's going to be happening in this community, which is very, very important to all of us. Before we end the meeting, I want to thank everybody for being here today. And the League of Women Voters in Lexington look forward to another exciting year of educating and registering voters. We can't do our work without all of you. We'd like to have another little Wheel of Fortune. And then I wanted to tell you that we hope to have a canvassing event in Lexington, May 6th. So mark your calendars. More details will be forthcoming as we pull that together, probably with Civic Lex, that group has become a great collaboration for the League, and we appreciate all that they have helped us do. So thank you again, Rona and Barbara.
I just wanted to let everybody know that our candidate forums for the primary are up. You can go to the website and you should have a direct link there. It's also on our YouTube, and it also should be on Civic Lex. So some really good and thoughtful answers from our candidates this year.
Thanks, everybody.